Matt, once again, thank you very much for taking the time to talking to us. Last time was very interesting and entertaining as usual. And of course, we wanted to talk a bit more about now your field of expertise, which is basically police work. Many
Uh,
years of experience, of course, you've seen many cases. Um, and of course, you train a lot of people. I guess a lot of officers coming to you and explaining what would you do in this scenario, this happened with me, and so on. I had a chance to, I think once or twice to visit you at that one of
mm,
the offices where I used to train downstairs, and actually watch for a few minutes, some of the guys training and all that. So it was very, very good, very entertaining. Can you now expand a little bit more when it comes to self-defense, reasonable use of force, citizens arrest, you name it.
I mean,
How do we start? Do we ask
yeah.
questions
Well,
first, or
no,
you just
no,
gonna
that's
go
okay.
and
I've
bombard
got
us?
I've got something prepared. You see,
Haha,
because I'm
excellent.
that kind of guy. No, actually, the law around use of force is very, very straightforward. To be fair, it's just that people get very I wouldn't say scared, but they're full of trepidation because you see um, newspaper reports every day saying X tackled a burglar and now X is in jail and the burglar is free and stuff like that. And it's always sensational, but that's why they print it. It's because, it's there to sell newspapers. Ultimately, it's not about actually telling you anything interesting. It's just about the bottom line. So actually, when you learn about reasonable force, uh, the most sort of common reactions I got whenever I would do like a delivery on the use of force would be the end of it. They'd say, "Oh, is that it? I thought it would be more difficult than that." And it's like, no, it really is that simple. You've got to remember that most of our original legislation predates Parliament all the way back past Oliver Cromwell and stuff like that. So it has to be simple to understand because the people that were being governed, absolute base level peasants who are out there like something out of a Monty Python film, they had to know where they stood. So the law is actually very, very straightforward. Now, I see that Michael has joined us. Hello, Michael. And Michael asked a question last time, which says, I'd be interested to hear Matt's views on how the threats to police and civilians. I don't know if that has changed or accelerated because there's sort of like word missing during his time on the force and common attacks. I'll answer that first before I go into the main thing. But basically, it's really interesting how life progresses because when I joined the police, we didn't have mobile phones. I was one of the first ones. I was certainly the first one at Hendon at the time to get one. And these were the one-to-one phones where every evening from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. the next day and all weekend, the calls to surrounding areas were free. So you wouldn't get any sort of contract like that these days, but it's interesting how society has moved on. No, there was no internet really. There was no Google. There was nothing. I remember seeing Robert Englund, the guy who plays Freddy Krueger in the movies, just walking across Trafalgar Square during one of the May Day riots, just so surreal. And we said to my friend, he was the only one amongst us who had a mobile phone that had a camera, but it was a camera you plugged on, and he said, "I didn't bring it with me." And it's like, oh. And how we change now, millions of photos taken every minute. So I think how life has changed in regards to since I've been in the police is that people, because of, I think the worst invention in the world that's ever happened is the comments box on the internet. As soon as you opened up a comments box, you gave some real morons a voice. And a lot of people will always listen that, the squeakiest wheel gets the grease. And you tend to get a lot of people now who come on, they'll put their opinion online, and a lot of people just go for it as it's completely gospel. So what you find is that people now have a much broader laissez-faire attitude, and they think that nothing really matters and everything's okay for them to do this, that, and the other, because there's no consequences, no repercussions. So I think we get a lot more attacks on us these days. You certainly hear about, there was that officer who was killed trying to stop a theft of a quad bike. He was being dragged along the road, and by the time basically the quad bike or the van had stopped, there was nothing left of him. So people just don't really sort of care as much as they used to. Certainly, there isn't as much respect. I mean, look at the British Bobby from the 40s and the 50s, the Dixon of Dock Green stereotype. There certainly isn't any more of that. So society has moved on, and so a lot of society has moved on a good way with regard to diversity and tolerance and stuff like that. But with the flip side, a lot of society just doesn't really care, and you can see that at the moment in the lockdowns, where people go out on bank holidays and just want to go down to the beach and have a barbecue and stuff like that. So you know, we face a lot more threats these days, and the difficult bit is getting everybody to just stay alert and aware of what is going on around them. But on the subject of awareness and that, because that is obviously a big part of Krav Maga, is to stay aware and alert to what's going on around you, and to have this situational awareness to see, to try and predict an incident before it happens, to see all the danger signs. You really need to know, you know, where do I stand? If I'm faced with, you know, 6 teenagers trying to steal my moped, one of them on crutches, can I headbutt them all and basically get away with it? And the answer is, well, yep, absolutely, not a problem at all. So I mean, everybody here, most people, only Neil and Anna are on a webcam. Hopefully there's some way that, nice to see you. Those on the webcam, I'm going to ask you to wave in a second, if anything, to answer my questions, because I'm going to put a couple of questions out, and hopefully you guys can communicate to Joe. It's basically a yes or a no answer. So I'll start by just giving you a few sort of scenarios and seeing what your opinions are. And these are all real life scenarios. They've all actually happened. So there was a security officer at an A&E department, and he was called to deal with a man who was sitting in the wheelchair, who was verbally abusing and inappropriately touching the female staff as they walked by. The security officer was asked to remove the man from the area until he could be seen to basically stop his antics. As he was pushing the guy out of the A&E, the man started to verbally abuse and threaten the security guard. The security guard moved away, increasing his distance. Didn't really think that use of force would be needed because the guy was sitting in a wheelchair, but the guy then leapt out of the wheelchair and began sort of advancing towards the security guy, stating he was going to do him. He kept moving away with his hands up in front of him, and the man, ignoring all of this, basically lunged at him. The officer gave him a kick in the shin, and then he basically fell to the floor and was jumped on as a big pile-on by the nursing staff. So in the circumstances I've presented to you there, if you think that was acceptable, if you think, yep, not a problem at all, either wave at the camera or just send Joe a message that says yes.
Timo said yes. Timo said yes already.
Tim said yes already.
Anthony says yes. Maxine said yes.
I can see people putting thumbs up.
Edward says yes.
Excellent.
Everyone is going excellent.
Good. Yes, okay.
They are a bunch of aggressive people that kick people in wheelchairs.
Oh, yeah. I don't know.
They should have gone for the groin.
Kicking cripples, attacking crippled people. I don't know what the world's coming to. Do you, Joe? Anyway, here's another one for you. He doesn't know what happened.
I have no
idea. A blur.
It was too long ago.
Okay, now we've got a paediatric ward. We're staying with hospitals. We've got a paediatric ward, and nurses are trying to prevent a 15-year-old boy from jumping out of one of the ward windows. Now, the ward is on the 4th floor of a hospital, so you're looking at a drop of about 60 feet, and the boy is trying to jump out onto what underneath is a pavement area. And the staff believe that if he does manage to jump out the window, then he's going to he'll die. He'll just hit the ground and he'll die. Now, the staff quickly managed to grab him to prevent him from jumping. And in the struggle, they all end up sort of on the floor because some fluid is knocked over. As a result of the struggle, the boy suffers a broken arm. So, again, send me some sort of sign to say if you think that was, yep, fine, no problem at all. CK is straight in there with a thumbs up.
Yeah, I'll give a thumbs up too.
Ha. Okay. Let's
better broken up than dead.
well,
there you go.
We'll come to that about
which arm is
more...
people asking which arm.
Okay, final case study. A police officer is walking through a public park in the early hours of the morning, and he comes across a man who is raping a woman by a bush just off the path. The woman has already received several head injuries from the attacker repeatedly punching her. The assailant is physically larger and stronger than both the victim of the rape and the police officer. The police officer radios for urgent assistance and runs over to the man and he kicks him in the head. The man falls over, and as he falls over, he strikes his head on the corner of a nearby bench and is killed instantly. The officer was carrying a baton, handcuffs, and an incapacitant spray and was in full uniform. So would you say the use of force in this scenario was reasonable?
Yes, it was.
Neil's not so happy with that one.
Neil's thinking, but yeah, he will say yes eventually. Not sure. Come on.
I'm a no.
No.
For that one.
Okay.
It was an accident, my friend. He was doing what he had to do. The fact that the guy banged his head and died, it was an act of God.
Any particular
Well, he
reason
did
why
have
you
the
think that's
spray,
a-
though, didn't he?
Yeah, but no time. The lady had already been hit in the head a few times. She was about to die, imminent danger.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're extending the case study there, Joe.
There we go.
So no time for the headshot straight away in that scenario
Yeah.
would be the applicable force. I just think that something else should have been tried in terms of like restraining the guy before actually getting to that situation. But you can always say that from hindsight, right?
Would it help if I told you that in the law circles, rape is seen as a lethal attack, can result in death?
Yeah.
I should have kicked him in the nuts after kicking him in the head then.
Well, he was after he killed him. I mean, he could kick him where he liked. Basically, it probably would have lessened the impact, but it's just a token thing. Okay, we'll come back to those later. Anyway,
but no, I think it was justified.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, here comes Anna. Go for it, Anna.
I just would like to say, like, what do you think about this woman being raped by this guy and being already abused? So we're talking about the guy being killed because he chose to commit a crime. And what about the victim? So I say yes in the terms of the domestic violence.
Yeah, that's not how anyway, I'll leave that to Matt. That's not how the law works, though.
I completely agree with Anna, but I'm just a bit worried that the way that the perpetrator was attacked straight away, even though help was called, I think the law might have something to say about that.
What about her? She was straight away attacked, and then she didn't really say. She probably say no to him, but no one really cares about her.
Oh, we're not making a moral argument.
No way.
We're making was it appropriate for a police officer to kick to the head rather than kicking somewhere else or using a baton? Should he have reasonably foreseen that might have led to a fatal injury?
Was it okay to guy to rape a woman?
No, so you're mixing it up again. We're not making a moral argument. We're not saying that was okay.
Let's see how this unfolds, shall we? And we'll come back to this later, but let's see what unfolds in the meantime, because your opinion of whether that was reasonable or not now may not be your opinion of whether it was reasonable later. So now at the moment, there's as I mentioned very fleetingly in the last call we did last weekend, that essentially there are lots and lots of powers under law to use force on someone. There's three main ones from a police officer's point of view. There's three main ones. You have common law, which is what I've said predates Parliament, so there's no act, no year. It's just written by our forefathers with a big silver pencil. Then you've got the Criminal Law Act 1967, which talks about reasonable force, which I'll come to in a second. And for police officers to use force, we tend to use force under Section 117 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, which gives us power to use force to carry out our job, basically, unless other things apply. So the general rule of law that relates to reasonable force is found, as I mentioned, in Section 3 of the Criminal Law Act 1967, and that says, there's different types of powers as well. If you ever look up legislation, you'll see that there are powers that are just for police officers, and then you've got powers that anybody can use. So to know which one you're looking at, a police officer power will describe a constable as using the power, and an any person power is literally any person. So the Criminal Law Act says any person may use such force as is reasonable in the circumstances in preventing a crime or in effecting or assisting in the lawful arrest of offenders or suspected offenders or of persons unlawfully at large. So that is kind of where you find most people, store detectives will operate under this a lot when they apprehend somebody who's trying to leave the store. If you find somebody making a citizen's arrest, anybody can arrest anybody they think is committing an offence, but the power you're using to actually physically lay hands on them will come from Section 3 of the Criminal Law Act. So when it comes to that legislation, though, it has this word reasonable force. Now, a couple of years ago, I went out to an Indian restaurant, and there was two of us, and the bill for two of us came. I don't drink, so there's no alcohol on the bill. The bill for two of us came to about £88, and to a lot of people, that might not be reasonable for the quality of the food and just the sheer experience. I'd have probably paid twice that, to be honest. So it's really hard to sort of say when you're using force, you know, what is reasonable? It's a very wishy-washy term. It doesn't really nail anything down. So actually, the courts look on. There is a test, or there's several tests, but the main test that the courts use is they look for two main elements. The first element is. Oh, hold it closer. No, it's not going to do it. Oh, my background's washing it out. Never mind. Is it necessary? That's what my card says. So in the first instance, it must have been necessary to use force. We'll cover when something isn't necessary in a moment. So if you've got force which is necessary to be used, you move to the second stage, which is it proportionate to the harm or crime or mischief that the individual is trying to prevent or terminate? A proportionality standard has evolved through case law, and generally the law likes to say that the force used to repel the crime must be proportionate to the force threatened. I'll oversimplify it now, and basically A is attacking B. What is the likely injury to B if you do not intervene? That is your kind of level for what you can do to A. Obviously, I'll sidetrack a little bit here just to reverse on the oversimplification, because we all have done Krav Maga at some point. If I said that somebody was A was attacking B with a knife, what is the likely injury that B would suffer if I didn't intervene? It's probably going to be a fatal injury. So if I stab A independently, that would be reasonable, because if I didn't stab A, he would probably stab B. Now, if A was attacking B with a rolled up copy of Metro and I stabbed A, would that be reasonable? Well, anybody really with a Krav Maga background could probably say, well, you can kill somebody with a rolled up copy of Metro. It depends on how he's using it. But on face value, being stabbed while you're attacking somebody with a rolled up newspaper is probably not going to go in your favor. So we have to remember that we have this: A is attacking B. If I do not intervene, what is the likely injury that's going to be suffered by B? That is my benchmark for what I do to A. Now, the main thing to bear in mind with necessity and proportionality is that if it is not necessary to use force, so that force should not have been used, then you cannot construct an argument in law that even though we shouldn't have done it, the force we used was proportionate. So you can have in law necessary but not proportionate, and for it to be reasonable. I'll come on to those later. But you can never have not necessary plus proportionate. Okay, so necessary. What makes something necessary? Well, a former very senior QC in the country, a guy called Andrew Ashworth, he was a very, very senior professor of law at Oxford University up until about 4 years ago. Held a post for about 17 years. He wrote a book called Principles of Criminal Law. And in that, he tried to organise a lot of cases of self-defence around necessity. And he highlighted 6 aspects of necessity. So basically, these 6 areas are where it is necessary to use force at the time. So the first one is the threat imminent? Second one was duty to avoid conflict. The third one was protection of the home. Fourth one was freedom of movement. Fifth was a preemptive strike. And the sixth one was law enforcement, which obviously I have a vested interest in. So the first one is the threat imminent. Now, defensive force can only be necessary if an attack is imminent or immediate. If there is time to warn the police, then that is the course of action that should be taken, in preference to a private individual using force. So that also, you have to look at other legislation, such as offensive weapons and things like that. It does not mean that the law allows you to keep armaments in anticipation of an attack, and it does not give basically an excuse for you to carry weapons all the time just in case. There's a whole different legislative field about offensive weapons and points and blades and stuff like that, but basically having it just in case you're going to be threatened and there is no time to call the police, that's not going to wash. There is a thing called instant arming, which is where everyday innocent things like keys or a handbag or an umbrella are used as a weapon and used very successfully, but not a problem. So the important thing there is, if there is time to warn the police, that is the route that should be gone down. Okay, so is the threat imminent? If you can call the police and they can come before anything happens, that's what you do. Duty to avoid conflict, point number 2. One of the most technical but very, very significant elements in common law, especially around self-defense, was the duty to retreat, to try and get away first. This was not always practical. Sometimes people would be being attacked before they had a chance to do anything and they couldn't retreat, they were being set upon. So that duty has now disappeared. And it's been rephrased in legal circles to demonstrate duty to demonstrate an unwillingness to fight, or to temporize and disengage, and perhaps to make some physical withdrawal. Now, as I mentioned in the last one, essentially speaking, that is just the act of raising up your hands. This is seen as a very, very passive, submissive movement where you don't want to fight. And I also mentioned that in the circles of Krav Maga, it's very useful because that is semi-passive stance. And semi-passive stance, in my opinion, was always the most effective way to stand, because it ticked all the boxes. It gave you this, on CCTV and with citizen journalists, you have this somebody watching you and they're saying, well, the guy had his hands up. He had his hands up like saying, I don't want to fight. But from a Krav point of view, my hands were much closer to the guy's face. They were open. I was able to grab or deflect or block or do anything, basically, or maybe strike first or stop him from taking out something concealed. So the semi-passive stance for me was very, very useful for 2 things. So the key question when you're thinking about whether a person was acting in self-defense or in revenge or retaliation, basically, if you've got evidence that a person was attempting to retreat or withdraw or trying to negate the attack in the first place, that would get rid of the suggestion of revenge. There was an Asian family who were tied up by some burglars, and this was a Daily Mail story. And this had a really bad ending from a police point of view anyway. You had a family tied up, and the husband, the kids, the wife, and they said, oh, we're gonna kill you, blah, 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 open your safe. And they left them tied up, and the attackers left. And the dad managed to wriggle out of his knots, and he went to his neighbour who had a cricket bat. And they got the cricket bat and they went off down the street and they found the guys and they absolutely smashed all sorts of bells out of them. And they were prosecuted and they went, well, the dad went to jail. And there was a massive public outcry. And eventually the decision was overturned and he was released. And I thought that was a wrong move, because the attack happened an hour after the original invasion of the home. So the threat had completely finished. He had, and this also applies to Tony Martin, the guy who shot a burglar, Fred Barris, with a shotgun. He was claiming self-defense, but what didn't help him was two things. One, it's very hard to defend yourself against somebody who's running away and you shoot them in the back. And secondly, when the police visited him about a previous burglary the week before, he said to the police, if anybody tries this again, I'm going to shoot them. So there was very clear premeditation and a plan involved. So if you have this time element passing between the initial attack and what you do, it very much falls into the revenge camp. If the use of force is unnecessary because the initial aggressor started to retreat, then it will not be reasonable. So if somebody starts to attack you and you manage to get in a really good strike or a block or something that sort of makes the person change their mind, you can't then now carry on and go after them again. This falls into revenge. Once the threat has stopped, once the cessation of the threat has gone, then that's it, it's done. So duty to avoid conflict. Now, the third one was protection of the home. Now, a long-standing exception to the duty to retreat is if a person obviously is attacked in their home, because you can't really withdraw in your home. The whole place is yours. You can't really get out. Now, in principle, and this is in principle, a greater force is justifiable if the occupation of the home is being threatened unlawfully, more so than if mere personal property is being taken. So again, if you've got somebody who's you stumble across a burglar, they've got lots and lots of elements all wrapped up in a bag or something, you won't be able to use as much force on them as if the person was trying to tie you up, do other things to your family and stuff like that. There have been several cases where a firearm, sword or knife has been used against a burglar, which raises questions about proportionality of the injury that the burglar was received versus the sort of value of the property that was being protected. So when you're at your home, you have no duty to withdraw, but you have to, again, it's all about the proportionality stage being extra important, although here there is more, not sympathy, but there is more leeway from the law in the force you're using, but it's purely based on what your honest held belief of what is going to happen to you is. If you're just stealing stuff, it's a lot different to if they were tying your body up.
Can I ask a question? Can we
go for it?
It's very technical stuff. Let me try to get my brain to work here. If Joe is walking down the street, someone comes, pulls a knife and starts stabbing someone in front.
Yeah.
I'm right behind him. Can I grab and go for his eyes, twist his neck? In the process, I broke the guy's neck. What's
the likely injury that will be suffered if you don't intervene?
Okay, so that's tick the box. So in other words, you trying to help people in a scenario where we had in London Bridge the other day.
Yep. Can you wait for the police to come?
No.
No. Again, these days we have what is called an MTA, which is a marauding terrorist attack. And the rules have changed ever since Nasser al-Baghdadi went on the internet about 10, 15 years ago. And he said, look, all you guys who want to come over to Pakistan and learn to fire a rocket launcher, don't bother. Just go to B&Q, get yourself a good knife or hire a van and drive it into people. All the tools you need to do Allah's work are around you. Right. And ever since that day, everything changed on the terrorism front. And now we have marauding terrorist attacks where you have somebody who is quite lethally equipped, may not be carrying firearms, but certainly as carrying machetes or knives, and they are mobile. It's very hard to keep them under control. People will withdraw. There's nobody really containing them, even visually. So it's very, very hard to keep tabs on that. If you killing them means that other people may live, then yeah, that's a very easy argument for reasonable, or your force being reasonable.
That doesn't mean you're going to get arrested on a day, taken to a police station.
No, absolutely.
The whole process with that. So people don't think that you're going to walk away with the guy's front teeth like I wanted to when back in the day, but it didn't help.
The important thing to remember here is that our law, and I'll link into the Human Rights Act shortly, but our law with regards to reasonable force does not give you a green light to kill somebody if certain circumstances apply. It's merely giving you the right to use a specific level of force against somebody based on perception of a threat and the outcome. If the person dies as a result of that, then so be it. But it's not giving you a right to say, if somebody's doing this, you can kill them. It's you can intervene, you can use as much force as you perceive to be necessary. If the person dies, they die. Again, I'll come on to something called unintended outcome,
Right.
which will cover that, and also links back into the story with the police officer and the guy on the park bench. So freedom of movement was the next one. English law also recognises an exception to the duty to avoid conflict in those cases where an individual is acting lawfully at or going to a place, realising that there is a risk that someone will force a violent confrontation there. In addition, clearly a person who acts with the purpose of preventing crime or arresting a suspected offender cannot be expected to avoid conflict and is therefore governed by the proportionality standard. So basically, you know, if you're going somewhere and you think, oh, I'm going to a football match, which could be a problem, just because there might be a problem doesn't mean that basically you're going to have your hands completely tied and it's not reasonable. You're not going there to cause trouble. It's just your lawful right to be somewhere. You recognise that there is a risk in that place, but you still have the lawful right to be there. It's not an issue. One of the most popular ones is the preemptive strike. Now, the preemptive strike falls completely under common law, the right to self-defence. The use of force in self-defence is commonly these days, you look at prosecutions, the majority tend to be centred around preemptive strikes, people getting in a shot first because they perceive that they're about to come under an imminent unlawful attack. This is a really, really important rule of law and is very consistent with the lawful excuse of preventing or terminating a breach of the peace, which is also common law, since the rationale for self-defence involves the protection of an innocent citizen's vital interests. And a judge of all people actually said it would be crazy to expect somebody to have to wait to get hit first before they can take action against somebody. And he, you know, a High Court judge actually used the word crazy. So it was quite strong on the matter. So although a person who acts in self-defense is normally actually being attacked, the defense isn't limited solely to that situation, because it can be recognized that there may be situations where you have to use reasonable force by way of a preemptive action against maybe somebody who's being attacked, etc. Common law self-defense enables you to act against yourself or somebody else who is there. Yep.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
In very simple terms here, if I'm a 50-kilo female,
yep,
walking down the street, comes a 100-kilo guy with a, I don't know, trying to punch me, trying to grab me, put my hands up, tell him to back off, still came forward, kicked him in the groin, stomped him on his knee. So there's a guy on the floor with a dislocated knee and a very, very sore groin. Will that be considered self-defense?
Yes, it's down to what's called an honestly held belief. Now, when the police speak to you about this, they're obviously going to want to know. We have to justify every bit of force we use, whether it's cuffs, even just turning up. Sometimes is a use of force, and we have to justify everything. We're accountable to the public, and so we have to write things down. And anybody who uses force is also accountable, because you have to justify your use of force under the powers that exist for you to use force. So at some point, you will be spoken to, and that is the point where you start to describe the disparity between your physique and height and perceived skill and strength against the assailants. Yes, go for it.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Oh.
That's one point there. So I'm trying to give you, because when you're going down the route of the technicality and the word by word what is written in the law, it's a kind of a tough to understand that. So I'd rather give you A attacks B and then what. So which is more or less what we teach in classes. Example, you're standing down there, mind your own business, walking to your workplace with a cup of your very expensive coffee in your hand. All of a sudden, someone walking around swearing, shouting, maybe some mental health issues or whatever it is, all of a sudden looks at you and goes, "That's it. I'm going to punch you in the face." So from you going to work, feeling amazing, another day, all of a sudden you're there facing a threat, which you don't know if the guy is armed, if the guy is not. So what can you do in that scenario, example? Apart from bringing your hands up, trying to create distance, trying to move away. But if that fails, the usual kick to the groin and punch to the face, will that be enough according to the law?
Yes, as long as, again, it's all down to your reasonable held belief. What did you think was going to happen, and what did you base this on? The actions of the person, the words, their reaction to your actions, all of these things. So you basically have to see, the hardest thing when it comes to justifying any use of force is that your justification is locked in here. You can't plug in a USB stick or something or a cable and just get it out. You've got to articulate what you were thinking or what you were feeling. This generally is where most people come unstuck, because the use of force will be perfectly fine, but they won't be able to provide a sensible rationale for using the force. They won't provide enough detail. I wish I'd written less, said no police officer who finds himself in the shit ever. So it's very important that you throw the kitchen sink when you're explaining what is going on and why you did it. You throw everything in: the sink, the taps, the washing machine, everything. And then later on, it could be that a court will decide what is relevant and what isn't relevant. But basically, if you start low and then try and go high when you're justifying yourself later, it's a very, very misplaced strategy. That everybody wants to know, well, why didn't you say that at the time? So you give everything at the start, and then people will weed out what is important, what isn't important, and ultimately what is important will stick. It's the strongest form of evidence. Just give everything at the time. So in that scenario, yes, not a problem at all. It's all about how you explain yourself, which is ultimately that every single use of force goes down to how the person explains themselves.
Let me give you a scenario. I'm riding a motorcycle or driving my car.
Has it broken down yet?
No, not yet. I've got a new
okay.
One. So that me going to London. Lockout is, we're done. We're free as birds now. We're out on the street again, fighting for a little space on the traffic light. The guy cuts me up, shouts at me. I shout back at him. He stops his car, gets out of his car, starts walking towards me. Okay, so now from the point of view of the law, I should just pretend that nothing happens and disappear, avoid it, and carry on.
Well, no.
That's scenario A. Scenario B, I put my bike on the stand, I get off because I'm wearing my helmet, my protective gear. I throw a back spinning kick, hit the guy in the head, he drops on the floor, crack his skull, and he dies 2 days later in hospital. Now we are talking. So take it from there now.
Well, okay. I mean, the fact that he dies is completely unrelated.
No, just for the record, I haven't done that yet. But
Let's say asking for a friend.
I missed the back spinning kick, so never mind.
The fact that he dies actually has got no bearing on the force that was used at the time.
Okay.
Again, this comes under the heading of unintended outcome, which again I'll speak about in a minute. But again, you get spoken to eventually, whether it's at the time or whether somebody speaks to you later. And again, you have to lay out in very clear and simple terms everything that was going on in your head, why you believed what was going to happen to you was going to happen. What was the guy's actions? What was his non-verbal communications? Again, you put in the comparative things. You mentioned everything, including lighting, weather, condition of the footway, where you're standing, the clothes you're wearing, the clothes they're wearing, the area you're in, the time of day. All of these things matter. Is it, you may not know this, but is he local? Does he have? It could be friends nearby who are going to rush to his aid. Mostly it's about the comparison between one and the other. We did have a student, if you remember, I can't remember his name now, and he went to a concert at the O2, and while he was queuing to get into the tube, you remember this? While he was queuing to get into the tube station afterwards, his girlfriend picked a fight with some guys, and then she then slinks behind him, and he ends up knocking, I think, 3 or 4 of them down in the space of 2 or 3 seconds. And the police turned up, and you got these 4 guys, and they're all rugby playing big guys. And he's only about 5'6", 5'7". He wasn't very big. And they said, this man has assaulted all of us. And the police just looked at them and went,
Really?
Do you want to make a statement about that? And they're like, maybe not. No, I don't think this will be taken seriously. But you know, that forms part of his assessment, because he sees number of people versus me. Their size is bigger. They probably all had a drink as well, which isn't going to help for managing to bargain with them or to help them see things rationally. So as far as he was concerned, I need to deck these people and nullify the threat. If I can get maybe 2 or 3 down, if they've got 4 or 5 friends, the others hopefully will stop having seen.
Do you know what the funny thing with it? I still remember that one, because when he came to class, he was like
he
one
was
of the guys.
So excited.
He was one of the guys that used to say, "Look, you have to scan, you have to look over your shoulders, check the corners." Why would I do that? When he came back after that day, he says, "Now I understand why we scan, because I looked over my shoulder, I saw the other guys walking behind me, and then I did what I had to do. I grabbed the girlfriend and we took off." And that was pretty much it, what happened. So in his scanning techniques, his skills after that were phenomenal, because he actually applied that, you know, at work, if you like it. Yeah,
it was a really good encounter.
There was another case of a British kid in Australia that punched in a pub a rugby player, broke his cheekbone, and the guy had to stop playing, and there was a whole case about it. So eventually they let the kid go, because they justified, look, you're a rugby player, you're a massive guy, you should have, you know, you do this, violence for you is nothing, because you play this on a match every day. So the guy was acting in self-defense, he was scared, and he saw the size of you, he was half of your size. So it was a very interesting case a few years back there. But I've got a question here. Could I ask a question about the duty to retreat? Oh, that's a beautiful one. Realizing that the law is the law, isn't it a bit unfair to oblige law-abiding citizens to play victim, inverted commas, and behave submissively when confronted by aggressors, just to be on the right side of the law? Question number 1. Continue with that. Why do the aggressors get an advantage of being able to bully people, knowing that they would be forced to behave sheepishly, I'm trying to get that word right, and not just show them the place? In other words, it's always the case of 3 against 1, 4 against 1. People tell you what they want, you know, the usual kids in bicycles, hoodies, and you thinking, I'd rather walk away, because if I get into this, it might be trouble. I might be wrong. I might end up in trouble. I might end up in jail.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, the more that you saw, well, I mean, from a strategy point of view, it's quite hard to sort of articulate several things happening at once. So the attacker always has the upper hand. In any confrontation, the attacker always has the upper hand, because they know what they're going to do. Now, if you've got several people who are threatening you, intimidating you, if you've got an honestly held belief that imminent unlawful violence is going to occur, then you can use self-defense, whether that's on 1 of them or 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them or 5 of them or 10 of them, depending on how you see the threat. Playing the victim is very interesting, because ultimately these days somebody will be watching you, and it could be that their evidence is going to be sought as well, especially when it comes down to offences like a fray, which come under the Public Order Act, which means that somebody can be guilty of offence if they use actions, not just words or gestures, but actions which causes a third party to fear for their safety. Now, the third party in a fray doesn't actually have to exist. You just have to show as a police officer that if there was a third person there who had nothing to do with this, they would be worried. So by you sort of playing the victim, maybe overplaying it and being, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, that would work in your advantage. It also works in your advantage because, again, if you are going to be the attacker now and take a preemptive strike, you know what you're going to do. And this goes back to what I was saying last time with the knife threat, and keep the person talking, because if they're talking, they're not stabbing, and it gives you time to get the strike right, and it enables you to get the target selection right. So if you're there and your hands are always moving, saying, oh, please don't help me, blah, 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 and they're always going places, this now becomes normal behavior in the attacker's eyes. So my hand suddenly changing from this to punching him in the face, it'll be less chance that he's going to react, or a push or a slap or fingers in the eyes or whatever. So this behavior of being submissive actually helps to lull the aggressor into a false sense of security, because now they're thinking, oh, it's obviously work, unless you're really bad acting. Oh, this is working. Yeah. I'm going to get what I want, and then pow! Suddenly, you have that element where you can act and then extricate yourself,
Right.
and you've saved yourself a lot of problems later. On the preemptive strike, it should be recognised that it's only going to be reasonable when the person has done all he can to avoid conflict, unless, of course, the conflict could not have been avoided. So if they've already started to be attacked, because we do a lot of drills where the person just starts attacking you, instead of you standing there in a semi-passive and somebody walking around you and then throwing a punch, have your eyes shut and now you're being attacked. Deal with it. Open your eyes, calculate, deal with it. So there isn't, remember, the duty to disengage or retreat doesn't exist anymore. It's now like an unwillingness to enter into conflict. So the hands, the body position, the sort of, no, don't hurt me, blah, 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 I've got 10 kids, blah, blah, blah. And all of this. And what you're doing is you're making your position a little bit stronger in the evidence which is accumulated from third parties.
Oh, okay.
So because, I say CCTV everywhere. The amount of CCTV could be a bus driving past and it's captured you with your hands up, sort of shying away slightly, or shop CCTV or dash cam is now becoming an increasingly popular way of capturing CCTV, because it's mobile and it's always there.
Yeah.
So yes, all the things that you're doing to give the impression that yes, I don't want to engage, even if you're thinking, I think I can probably get a good shot to the groin here, and that will give me 10 seconds to get away.
Okay, so the question is, does the law change when being attacked by a teenager, which is all teenagers?
No,
it makes no difference.
No, there's no.
A friend of mine once had to defend himself against a 16-year-old teenager. My friend headbutt the teenager, which was the only weapon he had available at the time, when the teenager lifted a piece of a stick, which turned out to be a broken crutch.
To be crutches, yeah. Because
it was one crutch.
Was
my friend
slightly
had this,
disabled. Yes.
No. He had a broken foot, but it was another story.
He carried the crutch for fun.
Yeah. So eventually, the friend of mine, got this, of course, a statement taken, and the police said, "Look, I wish everybody had the chance to do that." So my friend ended up walking away. There was no issues regarding anything, despite the fact that the teenager lost 5 of his front teeth.
It's unfortunate. These things happen.
It was an act of God, yes.
It's a terrible accident. Yeah. People need to be more careful.
That's correct, yes. Oh, anyway, okay, so
moving on to the next one. So self-defense, the age of the person doesn't make a difference. I've seen, and this is one of the real a police officer's real pet hate, is when people like Daily Mail, etc., print stories such as police use taser on child. A child in law is anybody under the age of 18. I've met some 17-year-olds who can bench press 250 kilos.
Yeah.
So a child, technically, I mean, it's just using words to have some sort of agenda to get the reader stoked up. But anyway, the last of the 6 stages of necessity was law enforcement. So me, basically. Now, the purpose of somebody whose purpose is to prevent crime, apprehend offenders, can behave proactively. And this, again, is very, very common when police officers turn up to a scene which is about to go bad or start to go a bit south, and they'll start to get involved. Even things like big demonstrations, and they'll start to get in, and we go straight in and we start pulling people apart, moving them away, and somebody will, in some little so-and-so, will start chirping up, "Oh, that's an assault, that's an assault, I know my rights." When people say I know my rights, they don't know their rights. It's all the time. Anybody says they know their rights, the more they say they know their rights, they don't know their rights. Because if they did, they would just shut the hell up to start with, because they would know your rights as a law enforcement officer. So we are expected to get involved. That's why we wear uniforms. It's so that we can be identified as having these powers that we can use. That's why I give prefects a badge. If somebody's telling you to stop running in a corridor, they're wearing a prefect badge. The reason I have the badge is so you can recognise you're taking a word of authority. So we only wear uniforms simply because it's to distinguish us from everybody else, so that when we start using powers that not everybody else has got, people know that, what's happening. So the important thing with us, though, as law enforcement officers, is because necessity is kind of built into what we do, we have got almost basically a green light just to use force. For us, the most important thing is obviously going to be proportionality. So remember, you can have necessary and not proportionate, and it still be okay under certain circumstances, but you can never have not necessary plus proportionate. From a law enforcement point of view, because we're expected to behave proactively, again, even just us turning up in uniform can be seen as use of force. We just have to concentrate mainly on the proportionality aspect. So proportionality, as I've mentioned, is basically the force used or the harm caused by the application of force must be proportionate to the force threatened or the harm that could have resulted from non-action. So yeah, A attacks B. If you don't intervene, what is the likely injury that B will suffer? That is the level that you're going to put yourself at. Right. So proportionality is very, very straightforward. It really doesn't need any more explanation on that. What makes things a little bit more complicated is when you start to have other legislation getting involved, such as the Human Rights Act 1998. Now, the Human Rights Act, basically, it came into effect in this country in the year 2000. There's a lot of rights, and the one that we really focus on when it comes to use of force is Article 2, the right to life. Now, the Article 2 is what is known as a limited right. You have absolute rights where it cannot be broken, such as the right to have rights, Article 1. Article 2 is the right to life, but that is a limited right. So what that means is that you can actually legally have your life ended. And so there are certain things that would apply to that. The first one is basically the article states, the wording says, everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of his life intentionally, save in the execution of a sentence of a court following his conviction of a crime for which this penalty is provided by law. So basically, if you commit an offence where the death penalty is the sentence and you get caught and found guilty, you can't go, oh well, you can't kill me because you knew the risk before you got involved. So that's the first part of the limited right. But the second bit is the right to life is a basic right, and it should only be taken away when absolutely necessary. And again, so much is riding on two words which really don't nail anything down. But it goes on to say, deprivation of life shall not be regarded as inflicted in contravention of this article when it results from the use of force which is no more than absolutely necessary in the defence of any person from unlawful violence, in order to effect a lawful arrest or prevent the escape of a person lawfully detained, or in an action taken lawfully for the prevention of quelling a riot or insurrection. We don't get many of those these days. So ultimately, those two words, absolutely necessary, they are the Human Rights Act version of the word reasonable.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, for a friend.
No, this is not a friend of mine. This was on TV.
Let's call him Jay.
Yeah, J.A. The police was called in central London. A guy with a knife attacked and killed already people. He's out on the street. People with fire extinguishers, whatever, unicorn horns or whatever the hell that thing was, trying to stop this guy. Yep. The guy had a potential suicide vest with explosives on it. So the cop pulls the guy from the top of this thing. The other one goes and bang, bang, put 2 rounds of 5.56, which is a beautiful caliber, by the way, very fast, and it killed the gentleman. So would that go, congratulations, there's a little medal for you because you did what you had to do, even though you had to terminate his life. Justify the means, even though later on the suicide vest was to be nothing, just a fake bunch of wires there.
I mean, ultimately, with things like that, you're looking at, again, the intention of the person who's the attacker in the first place. Why would you wear that?
Right.
Even though, again, they know. I said, remember, the attacker has the upper hand all the time because they know what they're going to do. Right. They know that vest is not viable, but nobody else does. And what is the purpose for that vest? The purpose for that vest ultimately is to become a martyr.
Right.
Because once you expose that vest, the police really are just looking at one tactic only. Normally we shoot to stop, not shoot to kill. But when somebody starts pulling out what appears to be a suicide vest, and police officers are not trained in how to build suicide vests, so we're not going to say, oh yes, that was never going to go off. They've got to, again, make a decision to take the life of one to protect the life of many. So
for people who don't know the difference, when the guy have a suicide vest, normally the trigger is on the hand. So
it can be anywhere.
Yeah,
can be
but most
pads
of-
on the knees, or so that
Yes.
after they're shot, when they hit the ground, then it triggers. So
There
it
we
can
go.
be anything.
So the idea of shooting the head is to prevent from the rest of the bodies, because if I shoot the body, the guys, they can still contract his hands and explode. So if you look at the Brazilian guy that many years ago, that John Charles, the Menezes guy that got
Yeah.
shot mistakenly, but then again,
Let it go, man.
No, I have no problem. I would have shot him too in a very bad way, because the information they had, it was the guy. He was wearing
Yeah.
the stuff. So the police officer that actually shot the guy had nothing to do with it. They were doing the job. So the fact that they had 11 rounds around his head, only 7 hit him because he was still moving, the first 3, of course. So the idea was exactly the same. Hit the head to prevent the rest of the body from moving, therefore neutralize whatever trigger he might have be carrying. But yes, it's a tricky scenario, and I mean, hats off to the guys that have to carry a machine gun and use them under stress in a situation like that.
Again, everything boils down to what did you think was going to happen in your head? Because that forms the basis of your rationale for use of force. If you can justify your use of force, if you are if you're having an argument with your neighbor and you decide to set them on fire, fine, that might be the absolute right thing to do, as long as you can justify it. One of the beauties, I mean, the law in this country has its good and bad points, but one of the ultra good points is that essentially you can do whatever you want as long as you can justify it when it comes to use of force. So I've known police officers who've intentionally run people over with the car, as opposed to just get out of the car and say, "Excuse me, sir, can I have a word?" And they just run them straight over, because at that moment that was the right thing to do, and they justified it, and
that was
the
it.
people investigating didn't even bother taking their pen out and said, "No, not problem at all."
Right.
So it's all down to justification. Everything in our law about self-defense or use of force is all about justification. You will probably get investigated, but your justification comes out, and people will go, "Yep," or "No."
Back in 96, I think it was 96. I attended a course in the USA, and I was there for a few weeks training with a bunch of guys. And the cops basically at the time say, "Look, reason we use the force for us is basically like this. We stop the person, Mr. Matt, step out of your car, I want to talk to you." And you go like, "Screw you." Okay, so I'll pull my pepper spray or OC or whatever that is, CS, spray you with it. That was enough to put you in handcuffs and take you to the police station? Yes? Okay, that's it. Reason we use a force, I done what I had to do. No, Mr. Matt pulls a knife, steps out of his car, puts his knife up in the air. I pull my expendable baton and I hit the guy when I had to. The guy drops the knife, I handcuff him, take him to the police station. So you see, he had to go 3 levels up: verbal, CS or OC, and then eventually the baton. The next level will be the guy, Mr. Matt, stood up, grabbed the knife, run towards me. I had to pull my gun. I shot him in the chest once. He went down, end of story, handcuff him, call the paramedics, case is over. But Mr. Matt stood up again, run towards me with a knife for the second time. I shot him in the chest again. And this thing went on for like 16 rounds, for instance. At the end of it, it was justified because you did everything you had to do in order to stop this guy, but he kept coming back, coming back, coming back. Different than what is happening today when a guy goes, "Hello, officer," bang, 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 20 rounds on the guy's there. It's like, why did you kill him? Just say hello. "Oh, I was scared because I thought he had a weapon. He wanted to shoot me back."
Well, I spent a day with the NYPD, and they had a very, very interesting their viewpoint on their own personal safety was very different to ours. And this is probably because the country has just got guns everywhere. In this country, especially in the Met, we start at the bottom and then we will go up if things escalate. So we will take measures in reaction to something.
Was it reasonable?
That's right. There we go. The little
was reasonable
light bulb above my head moment. But yeah, so here we tend to react more than anything else. When we went to a particular call where a man was being violent inside an immigration visa center just off Times Square, the 2 officers got out of the car and they just looked at each other and said, what are you going to have? He said, I'll have the baton. He goes, "Okay, I'll have the mace." So they got their baton and their mace out before they'd seen anything. They had it just inside their sleeve. And then after about 2 minutes of talking to this guy, they sort of looked at each other, nodded, and then put it away. So I thought that it was very interesting because they were prepared first to take action if something was going to start to happen, as opposed to something is now happening, let's try and scramble around on our belts and find the right tool for the job. But again, that's a country where they have a lot of very interesting views on freedom and guns and constitutions. So you always have that extra danger element. My aunt, who lives in, I've got family in America, as you know, my aunt does not do road rage very well. And she has to really wind her neck in because one guy, one day, he got out of the car and he tapped his gun on her window. So, you know, my aunt
Brazil, the Brazil's like that. Yeah. What was that? You said again? Nothing. Beautiful day. See you later. Bye-bye.
My aunt is not a shrinking violet, despite the fact she's in her mid-60s. So, it didn't, you know, she has to be very careful out there. But there we go. So, the Human Rights Act, as we mentioned, it says that you can, if you're using force which is absolutely necessary to prevent law, prevent crime, prevent an insurrectional riot, which we'll leave to the side for the moment because that doesn't really happen very often in this country. But basically to prevent crime, get an offender under control, or to protect yourself or someone else. If you're using force which is necessary, but then the person dies, no problem.
Right.
So this is the thing. It's not giving you a green light to kill somebody. It's giving you a green light to use reasonable force. And if the person dies as a result of reasonable force, this is what is known as unintended outcome. So if I was, if I saw an old lady having her handbag wrestled away from her at a bus stop, and I pushed the guy, just pushed him, and then he slipped in a comical fashion and smashed his head off a loose paving stone and died, I wouldn't be prosecuted for murder because it was an unintended outcome. If, on the other hand, they were wrestling at the top of a very, very tall flight of stairs and I pushed him and he tumbled down the stairs and died, then I probably would be prosecuted for manslaughter at least, because I could have visibly foreseen what could have happened.
Right.
But where you have these freak events, there's no planning for those. There's no legislation. These things are complete one-offs, and they're not taken into account. It's like, so what actually happens, that the extent of the injury isn't taken into account with an unexpected outcome, because it is one of these act of God things.
The last question is, let's go back to the very first one. The guy raping the girl in the park and the police officer kicking the guy in the head and he died.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that.
No. Tell us that, Tony, straight away.
Well, I'll come back to that. So we mentioned about you can have necessary but not proportionate and still be okay, but you can't have unnecessary but proportionate. If it's not necessary, it's never proportionate. But you can have a case where it is necessary, but the force you use is too much, but it's still proportionate. How does this happen? Well, this is all thanks to a stated case called R.V. Hegarty. R.V. Regina is the Queen. All prosecutions are the Queen or the King versus Smith, Jones, Ambrosino, whatever. So R.V. Hegarty in 1986. Now, Hegarty was a member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and he saw, he was in the middle of a riot. He was a special as well. He was going into a situation where he knew, he'd already been at work that day, and he was going into a situation where he knew he was going to be on duty as a police officer for about another 16 hours. He was very tired already, and he was given a baton gun, which is a gun that fires very, very big rounds, the size almost of a tennis ball, like rubber bullets. And there's training around using a baton gun, but basically you don't fire them at people with a distance of like less than 15, 20 feet, because the size and the velocity can be problematic. Anyway, he killed a guy inadvertently, and there is a photo. I've seen a photo of the internet. It's a 1 in a million photo of this guy being shot, and you can see the rubber bullet hitting him, and his chest is completely caving in. I can't find it anymore. I don't know if it's been withdrawn or whatever, but what happened was, he's got this baton gun. He's on the front line of the police, and in the corner of his eye, he sees a guy lift a piece of wood to strike his colleague. Now, before they went on duty, they were saying to the guys coming off duty, how bad is it out there? And they said, oh, there's guys coming at you with pickaxe handles and cricket bats. They are really coming to do you damage. So already they've got this mentality of, we are being attacked with some serious objects. Anyway, he saw this guy raise the wood, and as he went to strike it, he quickly spun and fired the baton gun, and the round hit the guy right in the middle of the chest. It stopped his heart, and the guy died. And when they looked at the wood, it was like a piece of balsa wood, like you get on a for sale sign on a house. It would have just hit the officer and snapped in half, and the officer probably wouldn't have even noticed. So he was prosecuted for manslaughter. He was found guilty, and he went to prison, and they appealed it. And the judge said, and this is a phrase which is used in self-defense cases today, where a lot of force is used. And the judge said basically, if there, this is Lord Morris was the name of the judge. He said, if there has been an attack so that defense is reasonably necessary, it will be recognized that the person defending himself, here it comes, cannot weigh to a nicety the exact measure of his defensive action. So what the judge was saying, and see, normally when you're doing your everyday life, you see something, you're getting information from what you're seeing, you're making an assessment, and then you're carrying out an action in relation to that assessment, and then you see what changes. Has it made it worse? Has it made it better? And you carry on from there. But what the judge was saying here is sometimes you cannot weigh up all the information. You don't have all the information, and you just have to react the best you can. And again, if the outcome is that the person dies, so be it.
Yeah.
The force you've used at the time was reasonable, even if clearly in the circumstances there was only ever going to be one outcome. But armed with all the information that officer had at the time, he thought his officer was about to be killed, so he acted in self-defense of his colleague, fired this shot, the guy died. So this case, R.V. Hegarty, is a very famous case. It's a stated case, and now all self-defense cases basically look at R.V. Hegarty first to see if the person was unable to weigh to a nicety the level of force that was being used against him or another. So it's a massively historic case.
He did what he had to do at the time, given the information he had, and the split of a second decision, sort of.
Yeah. Okay. And as it turned out, the threat wasn't that bad at all.
Wow.
But he justified it, and the court initially convicted him, but the appeal, the first appeal was quashed, but then the second appeal, he got to somebody who was a real use of force expert, and you think, why has it only got to them now? But he basically said, no, we're going to do this. And Lord Morris, who looked at it, said, yes, this is wholly wrong. With all the information the guy had, there was nothing else he could have done. He used appropriate force, albeit that you had this bad ending. So let's have a look at that question again then from the beginning. So based on what we've gone through now with necessity and what you're dealing with and all these things, remember size, height, weight, perceived strength, perceived skill, what is happening to somebody else, what happens if you don't intervene, all of these things. So you've got the officer walking through the park. He comes across a man raping a woman by a bush just off the pathway. The woman has already received several head injuries. So this guy's already been severely beating this woman about the head. And the assailant is physically larger and stronger than both the victim and the police officer. Don't forget that just because a police officer has, these days as well, maybe a taser, it doesn't automatically mean that they're actually going to be physically strong or able to fight. That's the reason they have these things. It's so to give them an advantage when the odds are clearly not in their favor. So the police officer radios for urgent assistance. Then he runs over to the man, kicking him in the head. The man falls over and hits his head on the side of a nearby bench, killing him instantly. The officer had all his equipment. He was in full uniform. Was the police officer's actions reasonable? So ignore the death. Was kicking a guy physically bigger, stronger, who'd already given somebody a savage beating and was raping them, which is, as I mentioned, seen in law as a lethal offence. You can die from being raped, and it has happened several times, unfortunately. He has officers on the way, but how far away are they? Remember, this is night duty, early hours of the morning. He kicks him in the head. That's the use of force. So based on everything that I've spoken about, was the officer's use of force reasonable? Thumbs up or not?
It was, yeah. Yeah, we asked the last one.
It wasn't even investigated.
Wow.
It was so obviously a reasonable use of force to the internal investigations. They said, nothing here for us.
That was it.
Do you think, Matt, if I may,
so
on the facts, I get it, and that's fine. But some of those facts, were they established afterwards? And what I mean by that was, do you think the police officer knew? So you described, had beaten her several times already, and presumably he didn't necessarily know that. He must have made an assumption about that. So if after he'd kicked him, the outcome we have the outcome of him dying or whatever, and the facts turned out to be different, do you think it still wouldn't have been investigated?
No, he knew the facts before he kicked him in the head. He could see the woman had taken a savage beating. He could see the size of the guy was big and he was going to be a problem. And the fact that he was A, raping somebody in a public area, and B, had quite happily given her a severe assault. He thinks, I need to go in. Not normally we go in at this level, but under these circumstances, he needs to go in right up. He would have viewed a kick in the head probably as a much less use of force than hit him over the head with a baton, which is an iron bar, basically. Yeah. Although, in my experience, police officers can't use batons to save their life, literally. When I was training batons, I'd say to people, if you can cut down a small tree with a one-handed axe, then use your baton, because you clearly have the strength. It's a thing which involves you moving close to someone and using an awful lot of kinetic energy to get the job done. And if you can't do that, then just, keep it. My baton was always tucked in a place I couldn't get to it because it was just a distraction. I'd much rather have trusted my elbows or my knee or, like Joe, my forehead, things I knew that weren't going to fail or possibly not take an effect. So he would have probably thought, you know what, I'll just kick him in the head. Hopefully that will get him off. And it did get him off. But then we have this unintended outcome where the guy's rolled over, struck his head on a cast iron bench, and has died. Unintended outcome here is a very, very significant card that was played, because he had no idea that this guy was going to just roll over and die by hitting his head on the bench. It's no clairvoyance, but the force, all he had to do was justify the force he used at the time. And frankly, I think even though the quality, and I can say this on good authority, even though the quality of justification from police officers with less than 5 years service is as worse as it's ever been, they just simply can't justify anything to save their life. I think all of them would have probably had very little trouble in justifying this kick to the head.
Wow. All right.
I always said, because as I mentioned in the last one, I taught officer safety for 18, 19 years. I was one of the longest period of teaching officer safety instructors in the Met. I said that what you definitely don't want to do is you don't want to pick a fight with an officer safety instructor, because they'll kill you 4 different ways and make it look like a complete accident.
It was a suicide, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
He fell onto these bullets.
Exactly. Man, it's been, very entertaining and instructional and eye-opening as usual. It's always nice to go through. I like that you came with a theory behind it, and I tried to make it more like, Joe attacks somebody, somebody attacks Joe, what to do.
Joe attacks somebody.
Is it too late to ask a question?
No, go ahead.
Go for it.
Crack on.
All right. When we're talking about teenagers, and you said it doesn't matter the size of the person or age or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The size matters, the age doesn't. Okay, yeah.
I've handcuffed somebody who was 87 years old because they were going to be sitting there. So, and a member of the public, I'd arrested them for shoplifting, and I was handcuffed. And the police station was across the road from the supermarket. It was Sainsbury's in Acton, and I was handcuffing because I had a car, and I wasn't going to call a van out. The van was on the other side of the borough, and I didn't want to get a van to come all the way to me when I could just drive in 30 seconds. But I was handcuffing this 85-year-old guy who was quite frail, and somebody coming out was saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, he's going to be in the back of my car. I don't know what I haven't searched him. I don't know anything about him. He's more dangerous to me now than anybody at the moment." Yeah. And once I explained that, the guy was like, I suppose it was like he couldn't think of a reason not to handcuff him. So the age is irrelevant. It's all about the size. But crack on, Jamil.
All right. So I've got 2 scenarios for you. So first one, you have a bunch of girls, teenage girls.
Teenage girls. Yeah. And asking for a friend again. Yes.
For a friend, never happened to me. A bunch of teenage girls, and they're sort of coming at you, intimidating you, and then they're trying to attack you, and then you defend yourself and you injure them because you're much stronger, and it's about 3 or 4 girls, and they're much smaller than you. That's one scenario. Second scenario, an adult, maybe you're out somewhere and one of them is getting very aggressive, maybe in a club, I don't know, maybe she's drunk, I don't know, they're getting really aggressive at you, and you defend yourself and you injure them. Now, what does the law say about that, given that you're much stronger and sometimes, in the heat of the moment? measuring power and
everything
proportionalities.
Everything that I've just spoken about has covered this. So again, the sex of an attacker is irrelevant. We'll go back to the last presentation I did. If you ever met Magda, the sex of the person is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Women are, how many men are killed by their partners all the time? It's a sort of a hidden statistic. A lot of men suffer domestic violence. I suffered domestic violence a long time ago. So I'm well aware that women can cause problems. When attackers are drunk, they can be worse because their tolerance to pain is higher. Their ability to think logically has been completely taken away. So they can't see what their actions are going to do. And people will have this extra, Dutch courage, bravery brought on by alcohol to have a go where they probably wouldn't have a go before. Your role there, if you can clearly see that you are much bigger and stronger, you need to make sure the force you use is reasonable. Excuse me. And ultimately, at the time, the force you need to use probably won't be very much at all, especially if they're drunk. Ultimately, it all comes down to, again, every time you use force, you have to justify it. And if you need to set them on fire and then push them off a cliff, fine. It might be the right thing to do at the time, as long as you can justify it. And if you can justify it, law in this country will say, fair enough.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Excellent, man.
You need to change where you drink, Jamil, basically.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Oh no, here comes some drunken teenage girls again. Oh, get back.
I was just asking for a friend.
Obviously,
yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't think for a second that'd be.
No.
There's no way T-Ball would ask that himself. No.
No. Yeah. Anyway, man, it's been a fantastic experience. We've been here for longer than we
No problem.
normally
Makes up for yesterday.
No, yesterday was, I don't know exactly what happened. I'll blame someone somewhere.
I logged into a meeting and somebody was asking me about when are we going to go back to work in coronavirus, and I had to make something up on the spot.
I don't know.
I said,
Anyway,
no, Thursday.
We clicked exactly the same buttons today and it worked.
Yeah,
I'm not
it
sure
works.
exactly why. I haven't changed anything new. I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for watching this. And if you watch this in the future, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will, open your eyes a little bit regarding self-defense. That is not all bad against you. And you can actually do something. You can, be safe, go home safe.
Ultimately, if you go away and read Article 2 of the Human Rights Act 1998, it's half an A4 page. It's one of the most straightforward bits of legislation in the Human Rights Act. Article 2, Human Rights Act 1998, look at it on Wikipedia or somewhere else. If you read that and understand it and live your life to that, every use of force you have is with that in mind, not any of our common law, because common law is not written down anywhere. It's not got an act or a statute or anything. It's all case law and stated cases. It's just like anecdotal built up over time. But the Human Rights Act, if you live your life in terms of use of force to that,
that's it.
And you understand it backwards, you will never go wrong. Never.
Fantastic. Man, thank you very much. Thanks for that.
No problem. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
And thanks, guys. We'll continue this some other day then. Appreciate it.
Excellent.
Have a good evening.
Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Tomorrow.